They say that once you set foot in Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, something ancient might follow you home. At first, I didn't believe it. Why would I? It sounded like the plot of some low-budget horror movie. But now, sitting here in the cold, oppressive darkness of my own home, I can't shake the feeling that we brought something back with us. Something that doesn't belong in this world. It all started innocently enough. My family and I had been planning the trip to Egypt for years. It was supposed to be a dream vacation, a chance to explore the wonders of ancient history. We were an ordinary family. Me, my husband David, our son Liam, and our teenage daughter Emily. The kids were excited but skeptical about the history. Liam wanted to ride camels and see the desert, while Emily mostly wanted to take selfies in front of famous landmarks. For David and me, this trip was a way to reconnect as a family. Life had gotten so busy, and we needed a break, a chance to escape the daily grind and experience something magical together. From the moment we landed in Cairo, I was overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the history that surrounded us. The pyramids, towering over the horizon like ancient sentinels, were even more magnificent in person. I remember standing there on our first day, staring up at the Great Pyramid of Giza, and feeling something stir inside me. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like awe mixed with a sense of unease, as if I was standing on sacred ground that had seen far more than I could ever imagine. Our guide, a middle-aged man with a thick accent named Khaled, seemed to notice my hesitation. He smiled as if he'd seen it 1,000 times before. "The pyramids hold many secrets," he said softly. "Some say they are protected by ancient forces, spirits of the dead who still walk the sands." David laughed it off, making a joke about cursed mummies. But something about Khaled's tone unsettled me. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just part of the mystique, part of the allure of Egypt. We continued our tour, moving through the narrow passages of the pyramids, marveling at the hieroglyphs and the stories they told. Emily was obsessed with taking pictures, each shot more carefully staged than the last, while Liam kept asking Khaled about traps and treasures. But there was something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Every so often, I felt like we were being watched, not by other tourists, but by something older, something unseen. I kept catching glimpses out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving where they shouldn't be, shapes that seemed to flicker and disappear before I could focus on them. It wasn't until our last night in Cairo that things took a darker turn. We had spent the day exploring the bazaars, soaking in the vibrant culture of the city, and had returned to our hotel late in the evening. David and the kids were exhausted, but I felt restless. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension I couldn't shake. I decided to take a walk around the hotel grounds, hoping the night air would help clear my head. The hotel was beautiful, a grand building with lush gardens and stone pathways lit by dim lanterns. As I wandered through the garden, I found myself drawn to a small, secluded area near the back of the property. There, hidden away behind a high stone wall, was a small shrine. It was ancient, older than the hotel itself, with strange symbols carved into the stone. I had no idea what they meant, but something about them felt familiar, as if I had seen them before. My heart raced as I approached the shrine, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed against the cold stone, a chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my hand away as if I had been burned. That night, I had the first of many nightmares. I dreamed of a vast desert, stretching endlessly beneath a blood-red sky. In the distance, I could see the pyramids, their jagged silhouettes rising like teeth from the sand. I was alone, walking toward them, but no matter how far I walked, I could never reach them. And then, from the shadows, something began to follow me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, closing in with every step I took. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. David was snoring softly beside me, and the kids were asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware. I wanted to believe it was just a dream, just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. We returned home the next day, and at first, everything seemed normal. The kids went back to school, and David went back to work, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, I dreamed of the desert, of those same pyramids, and of that unseen presence that stalked me through the sand. It was getting closer. I could feel it. Then the strange things started happening. At first, they were small. A misplaced object here, a door left open there. But soon they became impossible to ignore. Liam's toys would move on their own, shifting from one side of the room to the other when no one was looking. Emily's phone would glitch, showing distorted images of our trip, photos we hadn't taken. David dismissed it all as coincidence, but I knew better. Something had followed us home. One night, about a week after we returned, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was David talking in his sleep, but when I turned to him, he was silent, his breathing deep and steady. The whispers were coming from the hallway. I got up, my heart racing, and crept toward the door. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. As I stepped into the hallway, the whispering stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the hall, something moved. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing in the darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move, until finally, I forced myself back to bed. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just another nightmare, but the whispers continued, growing louder each night. And the figure, whatever it was, began appearing more frequently, always in the shadows, always just out of sight. The worst part was that I wasn't the only one who noticed. Emily, who had always been skeptical of anything paranormal, came to me one morning, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Mom," she whispered, "I saw something last night, in my room. It was standing by my bed, watching me." Liam, too, had started having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night, screaming about monsters in the desert. David still refused to believe any of it, chalking it up to stress or overactive imaginations. But I knew better. Whatever we had brought back with us from Egypt, it wasn't going to let us go. Desperate for answers, I began researching everything I could about the pyramids, about curses and hauntings. The more I read, the more terrified I became. Stories of ancient spirits, bound to protect the tombs of the pharaohs, of curses placed on those who dared disturb the dead. But the strangest story I found was about the shrine I had seen at the hotel. It was said to be a place of worship, dedicated to a forgotten god, a god of death and shadows. One night, as the whispers grew louder and the shadows in the house seemed to take on a life of their own, I realized that we couldn't stay here. We had to get out, had to leave before whatever it was took us completely. But it was too late. It was a few days later, during dinner, that everything came crashing down. We were sitting at the table, trying to pretend that everything was normal, when suddenly the lights flickered. The air in the room grew cold, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, from the corner of the room, the figure appeared again, standing just behind David. Its eyes, glowing empty, locked onto mine, and I knew it had come for us. David froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, as if he could sense it too. Emily screamed, and Liam began to cry, but none of us could move. The figure stepped closer, its hand reaching out toward David, and in that moment, I knew I had to do something. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a kitchen knife, and lunged at the figure. But it passed right through it, like smoke. I fell to the ground, the knife clattering out of my hand, and the figure vanished, leaving only the cold behind. After that, there was no denying it. David finally admitted that something was happening, something beyond our understanding. We couldn't stay in the house anymore, but we didn't know where to go. The entity, whatever it was, had followed us across oceans. It wouldn't just leave because we wanted it to. In the end, we had no choice but to confront it. I reached out to Khaled, our guide from Egypt, begging for answers. Khaled was hesitant when I reached out to him, almost as if he didn't want to talk about it. There are some things better left forgotten, he warned. But I was desperate. I pleaded with him until finally, he told me what I needed to know. "There's a ritual," he said quietly, his voice dropping into a whisper, as if the very words held power. "It's ancient, meant to banish spirits from our world, but it is dangerous. The god this spirit serves is one of chaos and deceit. The ritual will require an offering, blood, something of value, and it must be performed exactly at the time the spirit manifests. If you fail..." He trailed off, letting the silence fill in the terror of what could happen. We didn't have much choice. The activity in the house had escalated. Every night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the figure appeared more frequently, always watching, always waiting. Emily refused to sleep in her room, too terrified after the figure had appeared at her bedside again. Liam had started waking up with strange marks on his arms, thin scratches that looked like they had been made by claws. David had become distant, as if the weight of everything was slowly crushing him. We needed to do the ritual. I prepared everything Khaled had instructed: candles, incense, and the offering. I hesitated over the blood, but Khaled had been clear. It needed to be personal. Reluctantly, I cut my palm, watching the crimson drip into the bowl. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. We waited in the living room, the only space large enough to perform the ritual. The shadows around us seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, watching us. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Then, just as Khaled said it would, the temperature dropped suddenly. The room grew deathly cold, and the figure appeared again, standing in the doorway. My heart raced, pounding in my chest as the figure's glowing eyes fixed on us. Its presence was stronger than ever before, filling the room with a sense of dread so thick It was hard to breathe. The air hummed with energy, a deep, malevolent force that pressed against my chest, making my limbs feel heavy and sluggish. But we had to go through with it. David, pale and shaking, began the chant that Khaled had provided. The words were harsh, guttural, twisting in the air like the hiss of snakes. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it growing angrier. Its eyes burned with a fire that made my skin prickle, and the shadows around it seemed to writhe and twist, taking on monstrous shapes. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the flickering candles surrounding us. The shadows stretched and grew, filling the room, swirling like a storm. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the air became thick with the stench of sulfur. My throat tightened, and a low growl echoed from the walls, deep and guttural, not human. Liam screamed. I turned to see his body being dragged backward across the floor by an unseen force. I rushed toward him, but something cold and slimy wrapped around my ankle, yanking me back. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs, and for a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. It felt like dozens of hands were reaching out from the shadows, grasping, pulling, dragging us into the dark. David's voice faltered, his chanting turning into a stutter as the entity surged forward. I could see its form more clearly now. Its body was long and twisted, not human, with elongated arms and fingers that ended in sharp, black claws. Its face was shrouded in shadow, but I could see the faint outline of its mouth, jagged and wide, as if it was grinning at our fear. With every word of the chant, the figure seemed to grow weaker, its movements slowing. I forced myself to keep going, shouting the words now, even as my hands trembled and my voice cracked. David joined in again, his voice shaking but determined. The figure stopped, its body convulsing as if it was being torn apart from the inside. The growling grew louder, filling the room, shaking the very walls. Then, with a deafening roar, the figure exploded into a cloud of black smoke, swirling violently before being sucked back into the shadows. The temperature in the room returned to normal. The oppressive energy lifted, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, the house was silent. We sat there in stunned silence, panting and shaking. It was over. The nightmare had ended. I looked at David, relief washing over me. But as I got up to check on the kids, something cold gripped my spine. The house had gone too quiet. I turned back toward David, and that's when I saw it. The shadows were moving again, slowly at first, like a creeping fog, but then faster, rushing toward us like a tidal wave. The lights flickered, and suddenly, David's eyes went wide with terror. "No," I whispered, backing away. "It's not possible. We did the ritual. But before I could finish, the figure appeared again, reformed from the very shadows we thought we had banished it to. Only this time, it was different. Bigger, stronger. Its eyes blazed with rage, and its mouth stretched wide into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. "Mom!" Emily's voice was a terrified whisper behind me, and I turned to see her and Liam huddled together, their faces pale and full of horror. The figure moved toward us, its movements faster now, more aggressive. The temperature plummeted again, and I could feel my breath turning to mist in the freezing air. Desperation clawed at me. The ritual hadn't worked. It had only made it stronger. David scrambled to grab the ritual items again, but the figure was already upon him. I watched, helpless, as its long, skeletal fingers wrapped around his throat. David choked, his eyes bulging, as the creature lifted him effortlessly into the air. I screamed, grabbing the bowl of blood, throwing it at the figure, but it passed right through it like smoke. In that moment, I thought we were lost. But then, just as I felt the icy grip of despair tighten around me, a blinding light erupted from the corner of the room. The shrine, the one we had brought home as a souvenir, glowed with an intense golden light. I hadn't realized we had placed it there, almost like an afterthought. But now, it pulsed with energy. The figure screamed, its form distorting and writhing as the light from the shrine seemed to burn through it. I rushed to it, placing my hands on the stone, as Khaled's voice echoed in my mind. The god of shadows can be banished, but only if his mark is destroyed. The mark. My hand flew to the scar on my palm, where I had bled for the ritual. That was it. The blood I had offered. The connection between us and the demon. I grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor, and without hesitating, slashed the palm of my hand again, letting the blood spill onto the shrine. The light exploded outward, engulfing the room. The demon shrieked, its body twisting and dissolving in the glow, until with one final, ear-piercing scream, it was gone. The house fell silent once more. This time, for good. We stood there, trembling, exhausted, but alive. The air felt different now, lighter, clean. The oppressive feeling that had haunted us for weeks was finally gone. As we sat together, holding each other in the dim light of the shrine, I realized how close we had come to losing everything. Egypt had given us a gift, but not the kind you display on a shelf. It had given us a glimpse into the other side, a place we were never meant to see. And it had nearly destroyed us. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment if you've ever experienced anything strange after a trip. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and check out my latest adventure, this time from the safety of your own home.